solar mini-grids have turned from small pilots to an electrification wave. We were there when mini-grid regulation was established. When financial transactions were closed, we saw new technology thrive and companies fail. This is where we tell the stories. This is where we discuss the future. The mini-grid business, powered by Enensys.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the second part of Where to Go Next, which countries are at the top of the funders list, with Tatja Limonzava from World Bank SMAP, Dennis Nderitu from GIAP, and Benjamin Cornier from AFDB CEFA. Let's go straight into the subject. Yeah, when I hear you speak, what strikes me is that some 5 years back or so, the private sector sent out the message, we are ready, governments, where are you? We need the frameworks and we need the funding. Now, Ben and Tatja, now what you're saying is a little bit kind of turned around, where you're now saying, well, the governments may be ready now, but the private sector is not speaking with one voice, is not delivering maybe, or is not ready, needs capacity building to live up to the expectations of the government. Do I get that correctly?
So I think that there's often this confrontational attitude between both governments and private sector. There's often this expectation that the other will prioritize the needs of the counterpart. But the truth is the governments don't look specifically at mini-grid markets. It's just not their role. The role of the government is to design a comprehensive program to deliver electricity to its people. And it's not even just that. Electricity is it's electrons. It's the role of the government to create social transformation and economic change and support people in job creation, health, and education. So the governments don't really think about the needs of the private sector simply because it's not their job. Their job is to focus on the people. And very often when I talk to our developer counterparts, I have to sort of remind them of that because I hear their frustration. I really do. But I don't think it's helpful to fret that the government doesn't hear you, because it's not the government's role to worry about, especially foreign private sector and their priorities and their needs. And that's the same angle that I have to apply when we talk about tariffs, for example, because it's a very painful topic for everyone. And subsidies, it's a very painful topic for everyone. But the truth is, if you expect a government to create the right environment for you to come into a country, you will have to also understand what the incentives and the priorities of that government and engage in a dialogue, right? So that's kind of where we come in as well. Our biggest roles is to create that dialogue and that environment where each party understands the other one's needs and priorities, and that all of us are here to achieve the same goal. That all of us are here to deliver electricity to people at the lowest possible cost and the highest possible quality, and for them to actually achieve the economic transformation that they are pursuing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, Tatja, I have also been part of your team. I had a little bit of insight into how SMAP and World Bank, after all, works. What I saw is that there are also macroeconomic calculations being performed. Like if the government accepts a loan from the World Bank and needs to pay that back after some 30, 40, 50 years or so, then it must also make economic sense to them. Well, if they receive, say, $500 million, and this $500 million is then disbursed to private sector mini-grid companies, how do they justify that loan after all?
Because it's cheaper to deliver electricity to their customers through that rather than through taxing their overburdened national grid, right? And that is how we talk about it with the governments. What is the cheapest way for you to achieve what you're trying to achieve? And that truly is, from my perspective, the most important conversation, because these are all tools for the government to achieve its goals. The grid is subsidized. Mini grids may also require subsidies. I think we're all understanding that electricity access is expensive and it requires effort and commitment. No country in this world was electrified without subsidies. The United States had a massive multi-decade national electrification program with an agency that was dedicated to it to make sure that all of its citizens eventually got electricity access. And whether that was done through the national grid or through supporting cooperatives that had their own small mini grids, it was a commitment from the government. And that is the angle that we try to apply when we talk with the governments, is what is the cheapest way for you to reach each segment of the population with the right and most appropriately sized solutions. Because for some communities, the grid is the right solution and the cheapest one. For some, the mini grid makes the most sense. And for some, their current affordability is such that a tier 1 or a tier 2 solution, which is a standalone system, may be the most appropriate tool until they have had more access to appliances and things like that that would get them up with that ladder to a higher tier service.
Yeah.
So that is, from our perspective, how we establish that dialogue is what is the cheapest way for you to achieve what you're trying to achieve with this money that you're borrowing at very low interest, but still borrowing on behalf of your people from the World Bank.
I might also add there's an opportunity cost, and the ability to deploy just technically a mini grid is infinitely quicker than grid extension into the more remote areas. And that's a massive economic development opportunity cost for governments.
Absolutely. And we factor that one into the calculations as well, right? I absolutely agree with you, Ben, that is a really important argument that we also work to make, is what happens to a generation of children that do not have electricity to study, right? I know it sounds a very dramatic argument, but it's an important one because we all know that the countries that we focus on have a very young population. And in order to achieve the jobs and the education goals that the government set out for themselves, they need to have electricity. And they need to have it as urgently as possible.
Dennis.
Yeah, I do think every government is trying to achieve universal energy access for its people, and definitely for very good reasons that there's a strong correlation with economic development. I think when governments look at mini grids, they sort of want to really achieve that goal as their first thing, because this is why mini grids will be embedded in the national energy strategy or national energy plan, whatever a country calls it. But we are at a position where a lot of the low and middle income countries don't have enough headroom to get more public money to support the expansion of the utility. And these are utilities, as Tatia mentions, that are really heavily reliant on government. So I think, looking at mini grids is just trying to open up to more options so that they can continue to achieve their targets on universal access in a way that it doesn't really rely fully on them, but relies also on financial capital from other sources. The second reason is, I think, despite the industry not having scaled as much as we would have wanted, there is evidence of results where, we see mini grids going into communities and improving the economies of those communities. And I think for government perspective, any increase in the economic numbers like GDP, etc., is something, good for them. So seeing the capability of mini grids, which are, developed and managed by developers who are very customer-centric and really, really put a lot of time and energy into building the demand of these mini grids, which in the case of the user is building more production, which is more income, which really reduces the load of government in safety nets and etc. And I think finally, mini grids as is are some of the things that local companies are getting into. And I think governments are really happy to support, local industries, and having part of the value chain going through the local industries is something that is, again, added to the GDP and also creates a lot of jobs. When it comes to the private sector, I do think, yes, there is a bit of work that is still needed to convince governments that private sector is the right way to go. Even with all those, needs that government has, there is still a lot of questions about whether private sector is the answer for this. And all that is because of the legacy experiences where the utilities have been the mainstay of connecting people. But I think private sector should continuously show proof points that they are actually able to develop a least cost solution where governments feel, our money goes a long way into connecting more people than doing grid extensions. So this proof needs to continuously be shown, and there needs to be a way to show the progress across years in the way that mini grids are continuously becoming low cost, are continuously out competing grid extensions to several areas of a country. And secondly, questions that I've had personally governments ask is the sustainability of the mini grid model itself. So if a mini grid developer comes into a community and connects them, the government immediately marks that community as connected. But sometimes there has been incidences where mini grid developers pull out, or the level of service reduces extremely to a very low point that it sort of raises doubts whether this model will be sustainable, or whether the companies are in here for the long haul, or there will be some times when an electrified community becomes unelectrified, which is really a rare occurrence. But I think that needs to continue continuously be shown so that the government feels comfortable with supporting private sector and offering policy and regulations that give an enabling environment to the private sector. And pushing that to the next level, which is, not every private sector will be able to interact with government because then there'll be a lot of information coming in from so many sources. I do think the African Mini-Grid Developers Association really plays a key role in aggregating a lot of the developer concerns and aggregating the developer data on performance and all these other issues where developers would need to show evidence of why they should be supported. So data, first of all, for me, is the biggest component, that putting together data, putting together performance indicators, because the utility has those and it needs to report those to the regulator or to the government. But mini-grids, they're sort of in a line where it's not very clear whether they have to report it. So I think there needs to be a drive from the private sector side to show that they're ready to be accountable and, using AMDA as an umbrella body to put that together and then use that as an advocacy tool is going to be a very strong point for AMDA to do in the coming years. I sort of agree with the point of AMDA building the capacity of their members. What I feel is, to the point of now it seems like government is ready and the private sector is not ready, I do think the mini-grid environment and the sector itself has evolved over the past couple of years. But we still have the same developers in the same structure they were in a couple of years back. So there's a need to sort of improve their capacity to this industry or factory level thinking where it's all about efficiency, it's all about going up to scale, etc. So that is needed. And one of the things that developers lack at this moment is the available corporate financing to be able to actually hire the right people who create the pathways towards, this sort of mindset thinking of scale rather than project by project thinking. And I think AMDA can play a big role in trying to lobby the sector, lobbying the funders to sort of provide equity finance, which, gives developers a flexibility to get the right people, probably also reaching out to talents in the market who could become very additive to the sectors. I think AMDA have been discussing a lot about sharing resources like, CFOs or CTOs. We're still waiting to see how that is structured, but I do think, they should really be at the center of trying to figure out the capacity issue. And the next one is the clarity of direction. So if you were a developer, Nico, and you went into DRC and you are told they are very good sites because there are 1 million people living in cities, and as a mini-grid developer, that is really good because you have economies of scale. How do you actually build a site? How do you get to know that place? How do you get to build it? How do you know the taxes, the regulations? So this is not very clear in a lot of frontier markets. And I do think AMDA's role as being very close to government can help shape pathway for their developer members so that everyone or every developer understands what they should be fulfilling in several markets. Instead of hiring consultants or hiring people to do that, AMDA should really be trying to do that. And probably the last thing for me on the AMDA question is, what do they do long term? So now you've worked with government, you've identified performance, you've identified all these things, you've worked with the developers on capacity. What are the other key questions in the sector? And I do think things such as supply chain efficiency. So now that you have a big pool of members, maybe about 100 or so, can you use that power to go to OEMs, who are providing panels or providing batteries or providing whatever equipment and start negotiating with them from an umbrella level so that your members can now access this equipment at much cheaper prices, can get the economies of scale for this? Is that something that, can be structured at the AMDA level? So I think for me, that is the endline goal is AMDA becomes a very good aggregation tool for not only government and advocacy and data, but also on the other areas where aggregation brings a lot of benefits to the developers.
All right. Ben, Tatya, if you get a request from a government where no framework has been developed whatsoever for mini-grids, how do you approach that? Do you say, well, we carry you through until you're ready? Or do you say, maybe you want to approach GIZ or whomever to give you a little bit of technical assistance and then come back later when you're ready?
That kind of request we would deal with through our African Mini-Grid Acceleration Program. technical assistance, where we work with beneficiary governments, to try and put in place the structures and the tools to promote the development of a private sector-led mini-grid market. Where I suppose Tatia is going to be a little bit more agnostic, in terms of the ESMAP, and as she's described, a much more holistic approach to electrification, we're fairly unashamedly focused very much on the development of private sector-led green mini-grid markets. And to that end, we're presently working through the AMAP program in 7 countries, and that are at different levels of that level of preparedness. One example is we're working in Angola, where I'd say that's very much at the beginning of that journey. And so they're the kinds of conversations that we're having are much earlier stage, and it's really around the political decisions that need to be made that define a market. Do you want to use mini grids, and by how much? What is the role of the private sector? Is it purely as an operator, or are we looking to try and leverage its capital as well? Where do you want to set the tariffs? Because tariffs is a political input, it's not an output. And then as a function of the tariffs that you want to achieve, what are the longer term subsidy mechanisms that we can put in place? Because expecting donors to continue to fund until we achieve universal electrification is simply not a credible approach. And then other countries are much further down their pathway, and I think I'm going to repeat, Madagascar or indeed Mozambique, which has, in the case of Mozambique, a relatively now well-developed regulatory set of tools, but which haven't really been deployed in anger yet. And so we're discussing with that government about how to operationalize those, which involves site identification, structuring of procurement programs, and structuring of grant programs.
Does that mean, Ben, that CEFA is basically offering all the components? Let me explain a little bit where this question is coming from. My experience shows that governments would never ask for mini-grids if there's not an opportunity to receive some funding for mini-grid deployment and rollouts. And only once that funding is in sight, they would then also deal with the required regulatory and legal framework. Now, if you approach a government, or if they approach you, that is the first question. Do they approach you, or do you approach them? And once that has happened and you're in contact, do you offer the full package? Or do you say, well, maybe we'll find somebody to roll this out, but now let's focus on the development of the framework, which, according to my experience, doesn't really happen very easily without the grant funding in the background.
Sure. Look, there are examples of us approaching government, and there are examples of governments approaching us. And we provide that technical assistance to do some of that upfront environment development. And then we have in our arsenal of tools the ability to fund the programs afterwards. And I've alluded to the fact that we can do grants or reimbursable grants, or indeed even concessional debt to fund those programs. And so, no, we're clear about the fact that those are there. Look, CEFA, given its size, is not mobilizing the quanta of financing that World Bank is mobilizing in some of its programs. But I think the reality is, if we can work with a government to define and structure an enabling environment that works, access to funding is, I don't think, that challenging. There are a lot of monies within the donor communities that are earmarked for green mini-grids, and the biggest single challenge is getting them out of the door. And so, if one partner successfully puts in place an environment and a structure, other partners are very willing to come along and fund.
To follow up on Ben's point, from the bank's perspective, it's very much what you're describing, Nico. It can be either us approaching the government or the government approaching us. It's a long-term dialogue, so it's not just out of nowhere that we will have this conversation with the government. But that is sort of where we as ESMAP are able to offer an end-to-end solution. We are a fairly small team with a significant budget, but still, considering the scale of work that we need to do, it's catalytic in terms of unlocking World Bank commitments and World Bank lending. How we work is that teams come to us saying that the governments that we're focusing on are talking about mini-grids and asking specifically for mini-grid solutions as part of an energy access program. And then we go in and have a long conversation about what does that actually mean? And where does the government stand? And if there's no environment in the country at all, but the government is still planning to have an actual project, an actual lending commitment, then we get to working with them across all the different aspects that need to be addressed, the 10 frontiers that I had mentioned to you before, whether that be regulation or access to finance or institutional framework or training and skills development in the country. We work with the task teams to talk to the governments about what does that actually mean for you. So it's very, very upstream, but we only do this upstream work if we know that there will be a program planned, a concrete commitment from the government, and that there will be a project that will be developed, and that there will then be funds available through that project. Because otherwise it just wouldn't be the best use of the limited funds that we have and the limited time and people that we have available to us. So that's generally how we've organized our process. And we're very much stretched to the limit at the moment, I have to say, because most of our projects are scaling up and most of our client counterparts and governments are asking for mini-grid programs.
Yeah, which is an interesting development indeed. As you said, we are seeing increased interest in mini-grids in general. This interest is coming from governments, but there are also a lot of international companies in the market that are just screening the market and going to those sites where World Bank or AFDB or any other funder is in negotiations with government to set up a larger funding program. And then the question is, can local developers, which have not had the opportunity to gain as much experience as the few large international players in the sector, can they keep up? Can they actually accelerate their business as fast as the international companies can come into the market? What is your experience? There's a lot of discussion around, should governments accept international players to come into the market? Should they rather foster local domestic companies to pick up the work? How are you handling this in your communications with government, and Ben, on your side, even with your own funds to fund the private sector?
So this is one of those sensitive topics, right, that we have nuanced conversations around with the governments. There are certain countries where there's a very thriving local market that emerged sort of on its own, bottom up, quite kind of under the radar, like in Nigeria, for example. And that market is scaling and growing in response to the programs that have been set up, whether or not those programs were specifically directly targeting local private sector. And then there are countries where the governments have a strong preference for local companies to be significantly present. Ethiopia, once again, is an example of that. But it is our job to understand what makes the most economic sense, first of all, right, for the country and for the programs that we're designing. From our perspective, we cannot allow for programs to be exclusive and completely exclude certain types of companies from coming in and qualifying. But if there's a certain preference for local content to be included, then we certainly work with the governments on what that might look like and what makes the most sense. From my perspective, from what I'm seeing so far in the market, I think partnerships between local and international companies are very, very important because they just leverage the strengths that each partner has to offer. And it's a very rapidly evolving and changing market. So we will see all sorts of different configurations and models emerging, companies absorbing other companies and local players absorbing other local players and becoming more and more present in the market. But it's not a one size fits all conversation. It's not a simple dialogue to have, but it's a really important one because each type of company has different strengths to offer. It is also our job, a very important one, to make sure we don't create inappropriate incentives and that we stifle a nascent local market. So it is a longer term conversation that we have with the regulator, with the government about what that actually means and what would make the most sense.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. It is a very nuanced conversation. What I might add to that is the fact that the success of a mini-grid market, particularly if they're the first mini-grid programs in a country, are very dependent on the technical capabilities of the projects that are deployed. So we do need to be kind of mindful of the fact that someone who has got a long experience as an EPC does not necessarily make a good mini-grid developer. A mini-grid operator is an entirely different set of skills, that of customer engagement, that of demand modeling, that of encouraging demand growth, that of deployment of productive use technologies, that of revenue collection. So these are all very important attributes which are intrinsic to the successful operation of a mini grid. And therefore, I think Tatia's point around making sure that we blend the best of that international experience, which has been earned in kind of pretty hard circumstances in lots of cases, with that local content, I think is really important to make sure that those first mini grid programs are successful. Because if you are asking, because the counterfactual, of course, is if you are asking a rural user to pay 20, 30, 40 cents a kilowatt hour compared to an urban user who might be paying kind of 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour, then the quality of that service needs to be very, very good. And they cannot afford to have poor quality of service and then pay that kind of level. Just because these are rural users, it doesn't mean they're ignorant to the fact of, what it is they're paying.
Now I have a question that is specifically for you, Dennis. Among the 3 guests of mine today, you are the one which probably deals most with innovative business models. What are the most promising business models for the mini-grid sector from your perspective?
Missing loads, which for me seems like the easiest one we solve for, and that solves for scale. And after that, we get to points where it's very, very easy to even electrify the rest of the population because you've already achieved scale at sort of the lowest hanging fruit. We've always been trying to unlock the agri-processing question. How do you use agri-processing as your key anchor for doing power systems? Because, with this, you're achieving the dual goal of providing energy for whatever productive use you want, but also you're unlocking the incomes and livelihoods of communities, which is what you really want to do as a developer. So I think for me, the model we are doing in Ethiopia is really, really promising. I do think, Ethiopia really, really has done well on the agricultural side by doing aggregated farming. I think now plugging in an energy system and an irrigation is sort of the next stage of unlocking the potential of these communities. So for me, I'm really looking forward to what we get out of these pilot projects that we are setting up, because in a lot of countries, we will find similar scenarios where there's a lot of farming, but it's so subsistent and, it's so seasonal, which could really do with some irrigation so that you have the production throughout the year. So we went to Zambia recently just to do a mission on scoping and understanding the environment there. And I think I saw the same characteristics as Ethiopia, where there's so many farmers who are doing horticultural farming, which is really, really, very high income and high margin. But they're doing it using rain-fed irrigation. They're only doing small pieces of land because, again, you don't want to take a risk when it's rain-fed. The inputs are not enough. When we went there, I think the cooperatives there are really trying to optimize on providing inputs, providing capacity building for the farmers. And again, for me, looking at that scenario, what I saw was a replica of what you're seeing in Ethiopia, where if you were able to do a centralized irrigation system and provide water to all these people, then they actually have incomes to pay for your electricity, and you de-risk a lot of your demand risk as most mini-grids are trying to do. So for me, that is one of the promising ones, which I'm really looking forward to seeing what are all the proof points that we generate from that can be replicated. There are so many others, that are on our radar, such as all this talk of trying to add like social and public institutions and trying to think about models there. I think there's the more technical models where you de-risk by putting in technical loads or loads that consume energy when you don't have demand peak, which we are still evaluating. But I think we're going step by step and trying to see what proof points, what evidence do we generate is sort of for us the main path that we want to remain on, and see what do we share with the whole community of practice that we operate with for consideration.
Yeah, and this Dreams project is quite close to what other mini-grid companies are also implementing, like Anka, Mandulis, our own subsidiaries Jumeme and Volterra, but also Husk Power, for example. And I think there is some room for more exchange of lessons learned.
Definitely.
When I talk to mini-grid companies, mini-grid developers, mini-grid operators, one of their main concerns regarding funding programs is the continuous availability of those? Like in many cases, you have funding programs which are limited by implementation time. But it also takes some time to develop mini grids and implement them, and then to acquire additional funding, financing, equity, debt to scale. And the investors and financiers would always ask for how much additional grant will you be able to acquire to implement the mini grids that we are financing and investing into? And will the grant funding program exist long enough for you to implement all your pipeline? And then most of the companies have to say, well, I cannot say, right? Because World Bank programs are usually limited to 5 years. There is no guarantee that there will be a follow-up program. And that is one of the aspects that is at the moment retarding the fast-tracked rollout of mini grids in Nigeria, for example, but also in other countries. Do you have any reaction to that?
Yes, I do. That's another sensitive topic, certainly, Nico, that you touched on, but a very important one. We like to think of it as unfortunate, but also growing pains, right? And it is a really important signal to the government that, look, you have a flourishing market. You have a program that is dispersed so fast that it is running out of funds. And it is our job to work with our donor partners and to work with the government to make sure that there is a bridge and that there is a way for these funds to continue to flow into the market. It is not always a perfect system, but it is very much a clear signal to that government and other governments that, look, when there is a program that works, the companies come and they want to see you show up and commit as well. There are many different things. There are many moving parts in the market. In many different markets, things are shaking out differently. I certainly hear you on Nigeria, Nico. I think we've all heard a lot of frustration from companies on this, and I really don't want to downplay that. But from our perspective, it's on us then to try and figure out a solution, not just as a World Bank, but also working with other partners and seeing where other partners can come in and help us fill that gap while the new program is being finalized and becomes effective.
Just to add that, yes, Nigeria is obviously the example that you're referring to. I think it's the first time we've had a problem of this magnitude. And, it's a nice problem to have in some senses. I think that's why, it's an area where kind of country agnostic funds can start to play an interesting role. And I think it's where we see kind of organizations like UEF could potentially have a role in future, or even indeed the CEI fund, which has got different country windows. Longer term, I think we'd like to see those start to plug those gaps, particularly if there are unfortunate kind of timing gaps between different grant programs in different countries.
Dennis, do you want to comment on the issue of the stop-and-go characteristic that funding programs limited by duration introduced to the sector?
Definitely creating momentum in a sector, and then, a funding round comes to an end is obviously a bit detrimental to the sector, but also it's an opportunity, as Ben has stated, to create common instruments that we can consolidate funding into. So one of the key examples I could give here is the Universal Energy Facility, the UEF, which was built to become a consolidation of a lot of RBFs. And the reason here was so that we avoid this stop and go on RBFs. Is it possible to either put all our fund into one instrument and that ensures continuity, or is it even possible to even align on the processes of the instrument and then, have a way of all the funds being channeled in a similar manner? So I think, eventually what this will lead to is a situation where we have a lot of instruments which are cross-funder, which, will be funded at different times depending on the funder schedules, but they will ensure that the market signal that is created from the start is sort of carried through up to where the funding instruments are needed. So I think this consolidation effort and the discussions around that are really going to be very useful for the sector. And, if we get to a point where there are aggregated programs and people funding, organization funding into them, then we'll have a very good market signal on the financing side, matched with very good signals maybe on the government side in terms of regulation, matched with very good signals on the private sector side. And then we have a flywheel which is moving in a very balanced manner and leading us to the scale that we are looking at. That's where we would want the sector to go to. And that's one of the key things that we are putting as our ambition as an alliance in the energy sector.
All right. To come to a close, I would like to ask each of you to tell our audience a little bit about which programs and countries you're currently looking at and where you see great potential for mini-grid rollouts in the near future, and which countries mini-grid developers and operators should have an eye on.
So in the bank, really, we're looking at a whole different scale at this point. You would have probably noticed that, first of all, our projects are getting bigger and bigger. So the Nigeria Electrification Project is now becoming Nigeria Dares. We have a massive program in DRC, the Agre project, the Ethiopia Adele program, and Kenya COSAP, and those are just getting bigger and bigger. So those are obviously the biggest markets already that we're engaging in. And then with the new World Bank president has come a new level of urgency and prioritization of public-private partnerships and mobilizing private sector financing and bringing it into the sector. And so we're really scaling up our approach. They're referring to it as retail to wholesale. So we are also looking at larger regional programs, multi-year programmatic approaches or MPAs that we are developing. You would have heard about the Ascent, which is a regional program in Eastern and Southern Africa. And you're likely going to see more of these larger regional programs that target access, not just mini grids, but access as a way for us to not only bring a whole new level of financing ourselves as the World Bank, but to also unlock a very significant new level of financing from our donor partners and from the private sector and from the governments to bring into the market. So that's as much as I'm able to say at this point about regional programs, because many of them are under development at the moment, but that's very much where we're headed as the bank. So in terms of one specific market, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's one specific country or several specific countries we're prioritizing. It's really very much a continent-wide and a shift in vision that we are undergoing at the moment.
Does that mean that you're not going to leave any country behind?
That's my hope, Nico. That is what we're here to do, is to deliver universal access to electricity by 2030. That's our mandate, right? And a big focus of our work is also on the fragile and conflict-affected countries as well, right? We have very large programs in very, very fragile countries, Mali, even Niger and Chad and many others. So that is very much our mandate and our goal.
On our side, we continue to work on the DREAM program in Ethiopia that was mentioned earlier on in the call. And we have kind of other country programs under development in Togo and in Guinea. And we would like to try and kind of mobilize funding for Mozambique and Madagascar, in the longer term. But I think what I probably also want to point out is that structuring these country programs is quite a challenge, takes quite a lot of time. Tatia kind of alluded to that earlier on. And I think if we are, as we all are, trying to accelerate the pace of deployment of capital into the market, on our side in CEFA, we're increasingly thinking about ways in which we can put concessional capital into the market. And the other approach that we have for that is to then kind of fund on the debt or the equity side of the capital stack, which means in an ideal world, funding funds which developers can tap into. And so in that sense, I'm pleased to kind of refer to approval that we had earlier on this year to provide $10 million worth of concessional funding into the Cross-Boundary Energy Access Platform, which is, of course, an equity provider for mini-grid developers. Colleagues will be familiar with the recent announcement of the Series D capital raise for Husk. And there is undoubtedly kind of concessional capital that has gone into that raise from different financiers, and we're looking at a similar model for other leading developers and hoping to announce one fairly soon. And then I think we're continuing to look at opportunities for kind of deploying innovative funding tools into the market. And I'm particularly enthused by this idea of off-grid RECs, or renewable energy certificates, which have had obviously some impact on renewable energy deployment in grid-connected contexts, particularly in the global north, but actually bringing that kind of thinking to the global south and to development contexts, I think is something that a number of people are thinking about. And so we are actually kind of working on a project which would look at us kind of providing some funding into that as a means of mobilizing some funds there. So I'm quite excited about that sort of side of things, because it means hopefully we can kind of start to get some money out into the market that little bit quicker. Those are just a flavor of some things that we're working on.
We are going very deep into 3 countries when it comes to mini grids. That's Nigeria, the DRC, and Ethiopia. And I think it's a bit opportunistic given that these markets possess the largest unelectrified populations. And this is really where you can bring scale into the game if you are able to get solutions that actually work. But we also work across other markets such as Sierra Leone, Malawi, Burundi, Uganda, and Benin, where there are bits of work around mini grids as well, but not as deep as the 3 initial countries that I mentioned. So we are happy to, engage with developers. We are continuing to engage with governments in these countries. We're happy to engage with all the stakeholders who want to come into these countries in one way or the other, just to see where the synergies will lie and push this together as different strengths with a similar ambition.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks a lot, Tatia. Thank you, Dennis. That was very insightful indeed. Have a good night. Have a good day.
Thanks so much, Nico.
Thanks, Nico. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Nico.
Bye.
And thanks for having me.
Hello, this is Sylvain Boursier, Senior Mini-Grid Expert at Enensus. The mini-grid sector needs public contributions into mini-grid capex in the magnitudes of billions of US dollars. World Bank, African Development Bank and others are providing loans to African governments to allow for this money to flow. However, it's not the banks taking decisions on how to deploy the funds. It's the governments defining the modes of money flow. The banks provide the knowledge and run country-specific scenarios for the government to decide on. They also support framework development on request of and under guidance by the governments. This includes the development of laws and regulations in close collaboration with the respective line ministries. It comprises capacity building for those government institutions that shall handle the funds. And finally, procurement procedures are developed. The mini-grid private sector, represented by organizations like HAMDA, should play a stronger role in these early decision-making steps. They should work towards convincing governments of being open to private sector-centered approaches. This means that government should leave private sector enough room to implement profitable business models. The mini-grid private sector must continue to build trust with governments. This requires a lot of data about successes, which partly still needs to be generated, collected and compiled. Private sector must increase its effort in promoting itself as the solution to reliable and affordable electricity supply to rural villages and towns. Only once convinced of private sector approaches, governments will commit significant amounts of future African generations' taxpayers' money as grants to the mini-grid private sector today. As this process of generating track record to convince governments requires grant funding at scale, funds like GIAP and CEFA enter the stage to overcome the head and egg challenge. They provide catalytic donor finance to showcase successful business models, generate grant funding opportunities without forcing governments to get into debt. They help governments inform themselves about the opportunities the mini-grid sector brings along while carrying the opportunity cost on behalf of the governments. This is how the various funding instruments are complementing each other. Such a complex process with many stakeholders involved is typically slow. More coordination and clear communication about who expects what from whom would accelerate the trust creation process. We at Enensus believe that the mini-grid sector is on an exponential curve when it comes to trust building between governments and private sector. Many more countries will start taking loans for private sector mini-grid grants in the coming years under programs like World Bank DARES and others.
This episode of the Mini Grid Business has been brought to you by Enensus, your one-stop shop for sustainable mini grids. For more information on how to make mini grids work, visit our website, enensus.com, or contact us through the links in the show notes. The Mini Grid Business, powered by Enensys.